Alaska, vast, silent, and unforgiving. But beneath the snow and endless wilderness lie stories that should never be told. Radio signals carrying voices that shouldn't exist. Research stations left abandoned, yet not empty. Dog sledders who vanished into the storm, only to return. Not the same. And pilots who took off into the night, never to land again. These are not campfire tales. These are real encounters, whispered through Alaskan towns, chilling those who dare remember. Tonight, you'll hear for terrifying Alaskan horror stories. And once you do, never think of the frozen north the same way again. The tundra has a silence that feels endless. Out there under skies that never seem to end, sound doesn't travel the same way, it gets swallowed whole. I'd worked in those conditions for years, but nothing prepared me for what waited inside that abandoned research station. My name is Dr. Lena Carter, and I was a field biologist with a small team sent north in the winter of 2022. Our assignment was simple: evaluate an old station near Prudhoe Bay that had been abandoned since the late 90s. The records said faulty funding and harsh conditions had forced its closure, but paperwork never tells the full story. The first time we saw it, it didn't even look like a building, just a dark smudge against miles of snow. The metal siding was half swallowed by drifts, the windows sealed shut with decades of frost. The front door was buried nearly to the handle in ice, like the tundra itself had tried to keep it locked away. My colleague Mark cracked a joke about horror movies starting like this. None of us laughed. The wind had gone still, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed on our ears. We forced the door open with a crowbar, and the station gave a groan like something waking up after too long a sleep. Inside, it wasn't the neat time capsule we expected. Papers littered the floor in brittle curls, chairs toppled, equipment overturned. The air was thick, stagnant, and wrong damp and metallic, with a sour undertone that made me want to swallow hard against nausea. My boots crunched on something dark. Didn't want to believe it was blood, but the rusty smears on the floor told their own story. We swept the rooms cautiously, headlamps casting thin beams into the dust. The control room was dead, monitors cracked, switches frozen in place, radios stripped bare. But when we reached the lab in the back, the air changed. It was warmer there, humid, and the walls weren't just walls anymore. Something had taken root. Pale growths clinging to the panels, veins running in and out like a circulatory system feeding on steel. They pulsed faintly as though alive. Mark bent down to collect a sample, muttering about fungal tissue. The moment his glove brushed the surface, the material began to pit and bubble, as if eaten by acid. He cursed, jerking his hand back. The glove was half dissolved. That was when we heard it for the first time. A low hum, steady, resonant, as if it came from inside the walls themselves. At first it sounded mechanical, like some ancient generator still trying to run. But it had a rhythm, almost a heartbeat. My chest seemed to echo it, bones vibrating against flesh. I forced myself to dig through the logbooks on a nearby desk, pages stiff with frost. Most entries were mundane weather reports, sample notes, equipment failures. But the final entry, dated spring of 1998, stopped me cold. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. They're inside now. We can't leave. Mark swore he saw something move in the shadows beyond the lab. We swept our lights across the corners, but nothing was there, just peeling paint, broken cabinets, and those pulsing growths crawling across the ceiling. Still the feeling lingered, like unseen eyes were following every step we took. By dusk, the temperature had dropped sharply inside, and the hum had grown louder, reverberating in our skulls like pressure from the deep sea. When we tried the radios, every channel was static. Even the emergency beacon was dead. It was as if the station itself was swallowing our signals whole. That was when panic began to creep in. We decided to cut the mission short and leave before night settled completely. But when we reached the front door, the handle wouldn't turn. The frame seemed fused, sealed as though welded from the outside. We shoved, kicked, even tried prying it open, but it didn't give. The air grew hotter behind us. Mark was sweating, coughing harder with each breath. He peeled off his glove. And I saw gray discoloration creeping across the skin of his palm, the same hand that had touched the growth. We tried the windows next. Most were locked with ice too thick to break, but near the far corner we found one cracked from the frame. We smashed through, glass scattering across the snow, and crawled out into the bitter cold. My breath billowed white, my lungs grateful for the sting of clean air. But before I could move, I looked back. The windows of the station dark, all deflickered to life with a sickly yellow glow. And behind the glass, silhouetted figures stood in perfect stillness, watching us. Too many figures, more than our team. That was the moment I realized the station had never truly been empty. We stumbled through the snow, our headlamps swinging wildly against the blizzard that had risen out of nowhere. Behind us, the station's glow pulsed like a beacon, that same humming now chasing us into the open tundra. Each step sank deep into drifts, our legs burning with effort. Mark was faltering, wheezing through coughs that sprayed flecks of gray onto the snow. His face looked drained of color, veins dark beneath his skin. I shouted at him to keep moving, though fear made my voice tremble. By the time we reached base camp, Mark collapsed into the snow. We dragged him inside the tent, stripped away his gear, and tried to force warm air back into his lungs. But nothing worked. His coughing grew ragged, and when he finally opened his mouth to gasp, what came out wasn't blood. It was strands of something pale and fibrous, like roots. They writhed as if alive before falling limp across his chest. His eyes glazed, the grayness spreading across his cheeks. Within hours, Mark was gone. The next morning, his body was airlifted for autopsy. I stayed behind, too shaken to return to the station, too haunted by those shadows in the windows. When the report came back, it chilled me to the core. His lungs hadn't collapsed from frostbite or infection. They were filled with organic matter fibrous tissue that didn't match anything in human biology. Whatever it was, it had been growing inside him, feeding, until his body could no longer hold it. I tried to report what we'd seen, but the higher-ups dismissed it as stress-induced hallucinations, environmental contamination, or some unknown fungus. The official record reduced Mark's death to complications due to exposure. But the others on my team had seen it too, the pulsing walls, the growths that melted through gloves, the lights flickering to life with unseen silhouettes watching from within. We all knew the truth. Something had survived inside that station, and it wasn't human. I couldn't shake the memory of that hum. Even after we left, I heard it in quiet moments, in the drone of an engine, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the pulse of my own heartbeat. It seeped into my dreams. Some nights I'd awake with the taste of metal in my mouth and the feeling of damp air filling my lungs. Other nights I'd dream of the window, those figures frozen in place, their outlines blurred, as if they weren't solid at all. Months passed. I avoided the north, took assignments further south, but the whispers followed me. Colleagues told me I looked pale, restless, that I jumped at shadows. I didn't tell them what I really feared, that something had followed me back. Sometimes in the dark, I see shapes at the edges of my room, flickering in and out of sight, just like they had inside the station. Once, while reviewing old samples, I swore I heard that hum vibrating faintly through the microscope glass. I smashed the slides immediately, terrified of what might spread. The station remains sealed, forgotten under snow and ice. Officially, it doesn't exist anymore, but I know better. It's still there, pulsing with life that doesn't belong to this earth. Whatever the researchers discovered in the 90s, they tried to contain it and failed. It's been waiting ever since, growing, watching, learning. Sometimes, late at night, my phone picks up interference. A low, steady hum, pulsing in rhythm with my heart. And when I glance at the dark window across my room, I swear I see silhouettes reflected there. Not mine, not anyone's. Just watching. The tundra may have buried that station, but it hasn't buried what lives inside it. And I know one day it will no longer be content to stay in the ice. The radio room in my garage has always been a kind of sanctuary, shelves of coils and vacuum tubes, a cluttered board of dials, and a wall map dotted with pins where voices once came alive. I'm Tom, a ham operator in Anchorage. For years I chased drift signals and midnight chatter, truckers snarling across the panhandle, bush pilots bartering weather, a loner or two who liked to talk into the dark. But one winter night in 23 rewrote the rules of what a signal could be. It started like any other quiet night, aurora bleeding green across the sky, static gnawing at frequencies until a voice slipped in on an unused channel and refused to leave my head. It was faint at first, a scrape of audio buried under noise at 14.266 megahertz. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the recorder, then leaned in. The voice came again, rough and squeezed, words wedged between bursts of crackle. Mayday, Mayday. Grid square BP51. The frequency shouldn't have been carrying anything. I had it marked dead for equipment tests. I scrubbed my logbook for the square BP51. I knew, hugged the Bering Sea, a place where weather makes maps look foolish.
Ow.
The voice recited coordinates with an absolute, almost clinical rhythm, then began describing a crash that had happened, or at least had yet appeared in any newsfeed I could find. At midnight, the signal sharpened, layered like a recording replayed through a storm. It named details that felt too specific to be invented. Red tail, single-engine pilot, name captain, Ellis 5, souls aboard. It cataloged the wreckage as if reading from a salvage report. Compass bent, fuselage crumpled like paper, a panel blackened by fire. I called the Coast Guard before I let myself believe. They had no missing aircraft, no distress calls. Still, my recorder was filling with that voice, and I didn't want to be the one who'd ignored it if it mattered. There was this pattern to it, the voice listing times and coordinates, then repeating them like a mantra. It spoke in a timbre that made the hairs on my arms stand up, pitched halfway between human urgency and machine residue. Sometimes the speech flattened into static mid-phrase. Sometimes the voice layered upon itself so it sounded as if two people were saying the same thing out of sync.
Out of sync?
When it mentioned tomorrow and recited dates, I felt the world tilt towards something I couldn't place, either a cruel prank or something else entirely slipping through the seam of time. Sleep refused me. I sat with the radio like a guard with a dying lamp, tracing the frequency's breath. At 3 in the morning, the signal cut off abruptly. No goodbye, no fade like a hand pulling a plug. I scrubbed the recording with trembling fingers later and found nothing but noise where words had been. The file was a blank smear of static. I rewound again and again until the grooves on the cassette or the patience in my chest wore thin. Whatever I had heard existed for me alone in that room, wrapped in aurora light and old electronics. I told myself I'd been imagining things. I told myself I was tired. The following morning, the headlines ate my disbelief. Small plane had gone down near BP-51. Red tail. Single engine. Pilot Ellis. 5 dead. I watched footage of the shoreline for a long time, the camera lingering on splintered fuselage half buried in ice, and the stunned faces of rescuers whose uniforms looked too small against that country. I stayed quiet when they said accident. I kept quiet when officials muttered probable causes into microphones, and people used the word tragic, like it smoothed edges. The coordinates the voice had recited matched the crash site down to the minute. My chest felt hollow, like a place where sound could collect and never leave. Weeks stretched, and the frequency stayed stubbornly silent. I sat nights with the antenna tuned to 14.266, coaxial cable humming under the map lights, but the channel held only the same old static and the occasional test tone from a distant repeater. I had thought of reporting the incident, of handing over my log, my shaky recollections. But when I brought it up to other operators, their faces folded into careful pity and professional distance. It could be a delayed transmission bouncing off atmospheric layers, one said. A reflection, Tom. Echoes happen. That answer felt thin. Reflections didn't announce names. Reflections didn't know tomorrow. The more I tried to explain what I'd heard, the less sense it made to me. How could a voice, clipped and anxious as a life vest, speak facts about a tragedy before it happened, and then when evidence existed to verify it, leave me with nothing but static in my recorder? When I went back to listen to old logs, I began to find patterns I hadn't noticed before. Tiny anomalies at edges of transmissions like a secondary whisper. That might have been another voice, or a misaligned carrier wave that caused syllables to hang in the air longer than physics should allow. I don't sleep with the radio on anymore, but sometimes I catch myself reaching for the dial when I pass the bench. The aurora still paints the windows on certain nights. When that happens, the room takes on a distant, fragile light, the same light that was on the night the voice found me. It's ridiculous to think of airwaves as doors. It's worse to imagine their walls, thin and permeable, and that someone or something on the other side is tapping a message through. And the part that keeps me awake is this. If one voice found its way forward, are there others drifting in the static, waiting for the exact moment to be heard? Part 2 approximately equals 750 words. After the crash, the station asked me to keep a low profile. People in uniforms came and asked the same questions, cross-referencing times and logs, and I handed over my notations with a steady hand that didn't betray the way my mouth felt dry as bone. The Coast Guard took the physical evidence flight manifest, rec coordinates, and the news cycle moved on. But I didn't move. Signal's absence became a different kind of presence, like a missing tooth you feel every time you smile. I started reviewing my own recordings again, obsessively. I set up filters I barely understood, ran spectrograms across nights of static. And occasionally, for a coughing second, something strangled through the noise. A waveform that looked like speech but wasn't T-aligned to any human cadence. It was pattern and pulse, an almost musical residue at 14.266 that the analysts later called anomalous propagation. Their language was clinical, ionospheric ducting, precursor signatures. Mine felt like a bruise.
Wow.
Every time I thought I'd found an explanation, the trace shifted, like a creature rearranging its hiding place. Sleep became a thin film over my days. I'd walk into the kitchen and hear, in the hum of the refrigerator, the inflection of that voice. In the hiss of cockpit recordings I worked with for a charity radio broadcast, a syllable would bend familiar. I began making mistakes, missed appointments. Late logs and friends started to ask if I was okay. I lied, said I was fine. But the hum of the airwaves was in my bones now, and in quiet moments I felt certain something had latched on. 3 months after the crash, I received an anonymous package left at my doorstep. No return, no note, just a small reel of tape wrapped in waxed paper. The label was handwritten in a hand I didn't recognize. Listen twice. My heart jutted, slow and sudden. I played the reel in my old deck like a religious ritual. First I heard only static like every night. Then, almost as an afterthought, the voice returned, but differently. Layered, doubled, bleeding with a depth that made me feel as if I'd been eavesdropping on a conversation not meant for my ears. It said names I didn't expect, coordinates that made no sense, and then an instruction, or maybe a warning. Do not follow the echoes. I tried to interpret the message with the rational gear of a ham operator multipath interference, superfraction, delayed backscatterbutt. The words settled like heavy rain. Someone or something was speaking with knowledge that spanned time in an unnatural way. The anonymous tape contained a segment I had not heard on the night of the original transmission. Faint second voice answering almost conversational, as if the first voice had been calling out into a room and receiving back a practiced reply. The reply wasn't human. It sounded like vowels being shaped by metal, like breath passed over a broken instrument. It said, plainly, "We remember." After that, things stopped being simply eerie and began to feel deliberate. Instruments failed in small, intimate ways. My bench power supply would spike, then correct itself. The spectrum analyzer would freeze on a band, then blink back. My headphones sometimes carried a secondary undercurrent of breathing. Once, during a late-night net, another operator's voice dropped mid-sentence, and when he returned his name was wrong, he sounded older, and his log showed timestamps that didn't match reality. He apologized and blamed interference. He moved on. I did not. I tried to warn others. I sent emails to a few trusted operators and even to a university lab that studies atmospheric anomalies. The replies were polite and slow, full of curiosity, but light on consequence. "We'll look into it," one professor wrote, and attached a paper on transient radio phenomena. Their interest made me feel simultaneously vindicated and smaller, like someone who had stumbled across an old map that showed a place the cartographers had simply blacked out. Then, the night the aurora rolled in like a living curtain, my shack filled with voices. It wasn't a chorus, it was an imposition layer upon layer of transmissions that didn't sync, overlapping like old film strips. On my recorder, between the static, a voice came back, low-threaded with harmonics that made the hairs on my forearms stand up. For the first time since the crash, it addressed me. "You heard us. We were waiting." My hand shook so hard, I dropped the microphone. When I looked up, the room had the hollow silence of something very old closing a door. Since then, I've learned to distrust clean answers. The authorities dismissed the idea that the signal had predicted anything, citing coincidence and the orchard of possible echoes in radio propagation. A few online threads called it a hoax or a publicity stunt. But rumor is a poor mattress for the truth. If sound can bend and fold back on itself, then a voice can slip forward and backward in time as easily as a bird slips through wind. If that is possible, what else might those waves carry? Messages, warnings, memories, speaks when a radio fills with aurora light. I still keep the rig in the garage, though it mostly collects dust now. Sometimes, when the night is bright and the aurora paints the windows, I sit and listen. The air hums differently on those nights, and the hair on my arms stands like the teeth of a comb. I haven't heard Mayday, Mayday on that frequency since the crash, but sometimes my scanner picks up a fragmentan echo of a syllable lore, a different frequency that trembles with a modulation I can T-place. When that happens, I feel a small, terrible confirmation. Whatever spoke the first time is not finished making sounds into the dark. The wind up there isn't wind so much as a thinking thing. It arranges itself around you, studies the cut of your face, decides whether you belong. My name is Eric, and I ran dog teams on the razor edge of Nome for most of my life. You learn to read weather maps like scripture and to trust the honest rhythm of paws on frozen ground. But last winter retuned everything I trusted. Began as a training run 50 miles out. A thin moon, the sky breathing with aurora. The dogs were steady and bright, their breath scalloped white into the black. I remember the quiet that had no echo, the kind that makes a man talk to himself just to hear a voice back. Then they stopped. It was the smallest thing at first, a collective freeze, ears erect in a chorus, tails low as a promise. I expected a moose or the glint of headlights, something ordinary to blame. Instead, from their throats rose a tone low, layered, and almost musical resonance that clung to the sled like fog. It wasn't a howl, it a chant, and in intervals that braided together and formed patterns I felt rather than understood. I slid off the runners and crouched among them, palms pressed to the packed snow, listening until the sound seemed to thrum under my skin. I checked them for illness, ears, gums, pads, everything human hands know how to check. They were warm, alert eyes, reflecting the aurora with an intelligence that made the hair on my forearms stand like bristles. The tone rolled through the night and folded into itself, sometimes rising in a single voice and sometimes splitting into what felt like conversation. I tried calling them, but my voice was thin against that choir. I set up a small camp when the air cooled to a pinhead, threaded my parka tight, and watched the dogs sing until the sky paled with morning. I woke with a clarity I'd never had before. It wasn't the kind that comes from sleep, no grogginess to shake off, just a sharpening, as if the world had been focused through a lens overnight. I could see the serrated edge of frost on every twig, count the fine hairs on a husky's leg from 3 feet away. My hands tingled in a way that suggested new maps drawn under my skin, knuckles flatter, fingers more rigid, as if my palms were learning how to catch and hold differently. The dogs watched me with a look I couldn't name. It was not hunger or ownership. It was recognition, like a greeting from an old weather pattern. Neighbors noticed the change first. Old man Haskins asked me if I'd been sleeping outside too long. The mechanic, Rosa, said my laugh had dropped an octave. I brushed it off. People who spend years on the trail learn to ignore small alarms. They think the body is playing tricks, but the tones stayed after the dogs went quiet. At night, the harmonics threaded through my dreams and into waking hours. I could catch a pattern of notes and, in my head, feel where the pack wanted to go. The idea was absurd and immediate. I began to sense the trail differently, like a map unrolling inside my skull. The second week, changes sharpened. My grip grew calloused in ways only the Arctic understands, pads forming along the sides of my fingers, quicker to hold a line, to dig. My eyes seemed to pierce more deeply into blue distances. Headlights looked like distant lanterns rather than solid things. The dogs' song came less from their throats and more from a shared place between us. When I hummed a note of folky, and embarrassed at first, they harmonized, as if remembering a line I should have known. A neighbor's joke about losing your human felt cruel and close to true. I stopped answering some calls. Talking felt unnecessary when the tone said what I needed. As days folded into each other, I started catching moments that didn't belong to any language I'd learned. I'd find myself standing at the edge of the drift, listening to a silence that hummed with meaning. I'd step off the trail and feel direction in the soil's freeze, like reading the flow of water beneath ice. The dogs watched me while I did it, their eyes like mirrors. Once, I caught my reflection in a shop window and froze. My face was mine in the way a shadow is yours, similar, but with different edges. The nose looked a fraction narrower, cheekbones a touch more pronounced. Only someone who knows another animal's angles would have seen it. I tried to leave the trail once, to prove to myself that this was temporary. I hitchhiked to town, drank too much coffee, and slept in a bed that smelled faintly of a city that had forgotten how cold could turn you sharp. The change stayed. In crowds I felt a pressure, like being inside a tent too small for everyone's breath. The dogs' calls, now thin and far, would thread into my thoughts and pull me back north the way tide pulls the sea. Phones and radios became noisy, useless things that tried to translate a language of wind and bone into static. Midway through the winter, Pack's behavior pulled me to a point on the Mappa small cove where the aurora seemed to lay itself down like cloth. They ran with an eagerness I hadn't seen, tails high, feet sure on the crust. For 3 nights we camped there, and the tones intensified, shaping into intricate chords that floated up from the ice and dissolved into the lights above. On the 3rd night, the music folded around me and felt like a hand beneath my sternum, pressing gently until the breath in my lungs matched its rhythm. My hands twitched in rehearsal of something I had not yet known. The dogs looked at me with an expectant patience, as if waiting for me to remember. I think that was the moment I first realized I might not be returning the same. After that cove, the changes stopped being subtle and became a language I lived in. I left behind races I'd trained for, counted out the days like a man who was trying to keep from misplacing himself. My neighbors no longer invited me to the bar. When I passed children at school functions, they looked at me like a person who'd misplaced the shape of his smile. Inside, something else had rearranged itself. The tones were not just noise now. They carried intense suggestions for hunting lines, the geometry of wind, the names of snowdrifts that moved like animals. I began to obey them. My hands strengthened into an economy of motion that surprised even me. I could open a frozen latch with a flick, mend a rip in a harness with a single, practice knot, and feel the exact place on a sled where a runner would hold or slip. The dog singing was my compass. When I leaned into it, moving with the pattern, everything held: the snow, the wind, the light. It felt like a partnership, a giving and taking of hunger and focus. The thought of going back to town became a kind of betrayal. Not everyone thought this was a gift. One night, old Haskins followed me out of curiosity and alarm. He watched from beneath a hood as the dogs fell into a song, and I answered with a low hum that settled the team into a trance-like pace. When we stopped, the air between us felt different, as if the world had shifted its axis. Haskins said nothing at first, then he spat a line that sounded like concern and fear mixed together. "You re-getting away from the man you were?" I wanted to tell him he didn't understand, that I hadn't lost myself, but had found a place deeper than the ribs. Instead, I turned away, because the dogs were waiting and because the night had a smell I recognized now. One that promised movement and a different kind of belonging. The physical signs grew stranger. My teeth felt keen in ways that made me laugh once and then stop. The sound of my own voice frightened me. Food tasted different. 2 coffees suddenly cloyed and thin. Dried fish and raw meat held an honesty my tongue appreciated. Dreams changed. I no longer dreamed in sentences, but in maps, rivers folding. Wolf paths, bifurcating into a chase I both ran and observed. The more I answered the tones, the more the dogs matched me. They began to shadow my small gestures, raising a shoulder where I raised mine, tilting a head before I thought to look. It was a choreography that erased the distance between driver and team. People in town started leaving notes near my door, concern, wrapped in bluntness. "Come home," they wrote. "Get help." The thought of medical help and the fluorescent light of a clinic made me physically recoil. I did not want needles poking at what I had come to feel as whole. I tried to explain to Rosa once in the repair shed how the sounds mapped routes through storm and led me to safety, and she touched my forearm like she was testing for fever. "Eric," she said, the name heavy with the weight of the man she remembered. I wanted to tell her I was still Eric, just with more edges, but the words were caught between 2 kinds of belonging. Winter turned, the nights pushed a little shorter. The dogs grew quieter in their singing, content with small phrases and long glances, but I felt the pull of something greater. On a night when the aurora burned in stripes and curtains, a local search crew radioed in a missing hiker near a ridge. ID taught dogs to avoid. The coordinates were a crooked X on the map. Without thinking, I hooked the team and ran there, moving on instincts that smelled less like survival and more like a summons. At the ridge, we found the hiker alive but shivering, eyes wide with cold and gratitude. He said in a brittle voice, "They guided me." He meant the dogs, and the truth of it tightened like a cord in my chest. People praised me in the small way people praise strange saints. Hushed thanks, a handshake that sought to measure what had changed without asking too many questions. But gratitude is an awkward cloak. It did little to explain what I was becoming. The dogs and I started to move as one organism, my breath in time with their gait, my heartbeat a metronome for their chorus. At night, the music sometimes shifted into a strange low frequency that felt less like song and more like memory. In those hours, I would wake with a sense of being older than my years, as if I had lived lives that left their sediment in the sternum. The last alteration came gradually, like ice taking a new form under pressure. I stopped shaving one morning because the stubble felt right against my jaw. My outline in the window looked like a sketch of a man, and something else layered over him. I began to prefer the cold. Warmth felt like a foreign language. Sometimes I would stand at the edge of the pack and let a tone climb through me, until it settled behind my teeth. When I opened my mouth, the sound that came out had a timbre that was not wholly human, a harmonic that carried across the snow, and made the dogs tilt their heads as if hearing a parent's voice. What terrifies me most now is not losing my shape, but the idea that this change is contagious in a way I used to laugh at. It's not contagious like a fever, but like a language you can't unhear once it sets into the bones. I caught myself months later watching a young musher on the edge of town, feeling the tug of a pattern in his stride, and wanting irrationally and fiercely to teach him. The thought made my palms sweat. If I offered the tones as comfort, if I showed someone else how to listen, what then? Would they join the chorus? Would they become like me, trading certain kinds of humanity for survival and song? Now, when the aurora folds the sky into a low, green roof, the dogs look at me differently, no longer with the tentative respect of companions, but with the steady patience of a pack that knows its leader, remembers the old roots. I sometimes run my hand along their flanks and feel a warmth that is older than tenderness. The mirror still shows a man, but when I wake at night, I find my mouth humming notes that don't belong to any radio. The voices out on the trail answer sometimes and call in response. The last thing I learned is that the wild keeps what it takes and gives back a version shaped to its own need. The line between human and animal thins on cold nights. Don't know which side I will be on when the spring finally bleeds snow into mud. But I do know this: the tone calls, and if I go fully into it, the dogs will follow. The thought of becoming what I already fear is a kind of grief that has no words, only a long rising note that might be a beginning or an erasure. I sleep less now. When I wake, the world is sharper, and the dogs are already waiting, their voices folding into a new music that wants me to answer again. Night in the bush has a weight to it you learn to respect. I'm Captain Rachel Hayes, and I've flown Alaska's skies for 15 years. You learn the moods of clouds the way others learn faces. You learn how ice sings on a lake before it breaks, how a valley swallows sound. That December flight started like 1,000 others' thin moon, a freight of supplies for a village whose name only shows up on pilots' charts, and a sky so clear the stars could cut glass. I'd landed on worse ice and walked away smiling. That night, something waited on the lake that I'd never been taught to read. I was skimming low, visual on the water, because sometimes the light's angle gives you a shortcut through snowdrifts. The instruments were calm, the radios buried under the comforting static of routine nets. Then my spotlight caught movement, a single figure walking across the frozen mirror of Lake Etlin. At first I thought it was someone foolish or lost rare. Yes, but not impossible. I circled to check. The thing stood tall against the black, too thin to be bundled like a person should be in that weather. When I trained the light on it, my stomach dropped. There was no face, just an oval that reflected my beam like a polished stone. No features, no eyes. Nothing to tell me it was human. I radioed base, automatic, professional. Ground haze. Got a visual on an individual at Lake Atlin, sending coordinates. Static answered, thick and rude. Then the kind of hum that makes the inside of your headset vibrate against your cheekbones. I felt it before I heard it, a low, resonant pressure that settled along the back of my neck and made my teeth taste metallic. My altimeter wobbled like a compass caught in a storm of iron filings. My heading needle stuttered and then spun. For a moment, I thought it was a magnetic anomaly, anomaliology misbehaving. Planes have quirks. Planes misbehave, and we fix them with checklists. But instruments don't lie in chorus, and that hum kept singing. Below, lights appeared separate from the village, separate from any human source. They rose, small and pulsing like lanterns moving under the ice. Then they climbed, keeping pace with my plane. They weren't flares, they didn't burn, they breathed. I climbed, old reflex. Altitude gives you room, room gives you options. The lights climbed too, faster, clustering into a ring before separating again. Following my flight path, like a mirror of intention, the figure had vanished when I checked the lake a second time. Sometimes things move fast on ice. Sometimes they simply dissolve. The feeling in my gut steeled this was not a place for improvisation. The plane felt different then, as if the hull had weight beyond metal and fuel and added inertia. Something pressing from the inside out. Yoke responses dulled. Surfaces that usually answered with precise obedience now lagged like a stubborn animal. I trimmed, I fed a gentle correction, and the nose dipped. I fought it. I wrestled through autopilot checks and mechanical memory. And for a moment the yoke was a thing I knew by heart and could not command. I called again, my voice small and human. Haze to base. Instruments acting up, compass failing. Altimeter erratic. Static swallowed the words. The hum grew louder, threading through the headset, through bone, through thought. Over the intercom, the world narrowed to the plane and me. The wilderness outside seemed to lean in and listen. The lights below blinked like eyes that couldn't decide whether to be kind. Controls that had always done what I asked refused my will for a heartbeat. 2 heartbeats, the length of a sentence. The nose pitched in a way that made every instinct in me clamp down and fight. I felt the sleds of the skis kiss the air, as if remembering how to be snow, and the horizon tilted into a slant I hated. My hands ached with the effort of keeping the wings staying level against a pressure I couldn't TC. I braced for impact in a way I hadn't T since my first forced landing years ago. Hands tight, knees braced, mind cataloging everything. Gear, straps, the sealed kit of survival. Time compresses in those seconds. You measure your life in checklist items. I remember the cold spilling through a crack in the fuselage, minutes or maybe seconds, before the world pulled tight and lost the sound of itself. The headset filled with one final long tone, pure and ridiculous and impossible. Like the voice of a bell played in a very large, empty house. The last clear thing I thought before the plane met the ice was, whatever that thing was. It had chosen to stand in the place where no one should ever stand. Silence afterward is an animal that sits heavy in your chest. Rescue found me hours later, half buried in a drift. Frost on the collar of my jacket, the plane largely intact around me like a shed shell. They expected the worst, expected the tidy answers of mechanical failure or pilot error. The medics wrapped me and the investigators asked the same patient. Polite questions, pilots' dread at crash sites. The plane's airframe showed no catastrophic failures. Fuel lines intact. Engine that refused to betray a reason. The flight recorder was on my lap when they cut me free, its casing dented but not broken. I thought I'd have a play-by-play to hand to the FAA. Instead, the recorder's tape-war file. Whatever they wanted to call, it was a smear of warped sound. A tape you could look at and feel like you'd been reading a bad dream. At the debrief, the Coast Guard ran diagnostics. They sent my instruments off in boxes to labs with blinking lights and men with pocket protectors. Their faces were kind in the way strangers can be to someone who has seen too much. They found anomalies, brief spikes of electromagnetic noise on the band, traces that didn't match solar activity or man-made interference. They called them curiosity bits and cataloged them beneath other safer words. I told them what I'd seen, said the word face, and they pretended to understand, said orbs, and they squinted into the clipboard. As if squinting could redraw the night, didn't end with paperwork. The hum slipped into my life like a guest who refuses to leave. At night when I turn over in bed, there's a pressure behind my teeth like a note I almost remember. When I stand at the edge of a frozen lake now, the water looks back differently, like a surface that understands the weight of witness. I stopped flying for a while, because the thought of a headset buzzing that frequency sent my stomach into a tight, obedient knot. But the sky has a way of calling you back. We are made of roots in memory and the kind of stubbornness that answers its own name. Months passed with an investigation that yielded sympathy and a certificate that read no mechanical cause determined. Insurance folks visited with polite condolences. Pilots talked about whistling lines and odd magnetics over coffee in hangar bays. Some called it coincidence multiplied by stress. Others smiled like men who'd seen the weather perform tricks on instruments. I began to listen for patterns in the small things. The way my coffee tasted metallic in the morning, the way the runway lights sometimes flickered in a rhythm that felt like the tale of a song. Small things are how the void begins. Then, there were nights I could not deny. I'd be sitting at the kitchen sink, and the hum would announce itself, soft as breath. It would grow into a pitch that made the hairs along my forearm ripple. And when I looked up, because you always look up, the window would be full of a tall, thin shape standing at the tree line beyond my property. At a distance, it could be anyone. A hunter, a neighbor, a ladder propped up against the sky. Up close, the face would be impossible, an oval of reflective skin that showed my own kitchen lights. My own face, and nothing more. It would tilt toward me like someone I'd once known, and then vanish when I blinked. I tried to ignore it. I put my head down and kept appointments, and the world applauded in small, polite ways. But a pilot is a person who cannot pretend the sky is just background noise. Once you've had a machine refuse to obey you, you notice obedience in other lives, the way a dog waits at a heel, the way a child listens for a story. People began to vanish from lists, to the kinds of disappearances that are easy to file as cold weather accidents. A fisherman out on Lake Atlan, a hiker who left tracks that stopped at the edge of a snowfield. Authorities called them tragedies. Reef made those words soft at the edges. The recorder, when I finally got a forensic copy, was the worst kind of puzzle. Beneath layers of warped hum, an algorithm pulled at frequencies that corresponded to speech. Once tucked like a secret, there was a fragment that sounded like my name. It's not the friendly call of a colleague, but my name folded into harmonics, until it felt like a thing you could not unhear. In the lab, the technician went quiet and asked me, very carefully, if I recognized the voice. I nodded. It was my own, distorted and doubled, as if a reply to something I'd said before I ever spoke. I could have fled. I could have moved south, taken a desk job, let airports be places I visited only on other people's terms. But the sky is sticky for some of us. It holds like a lover's promise and gnaws like an old hunger. I moved instead into watching. I study coordinates I am given in coffee shop gossip, and sometimes I drive out to places where lights have been seen. I stand at a safe distance and watch the lake's face until my eyelids ache. The last thing that happened, last in the way a chapter ends and a new stranger chapter begins, came on a night when the moon was gone and the sky was a bruise. I was at the little strip checking a light bulb that had been flickering. The runway was a row of sleeping teeth in the dark. I heard a sound behind me like fabric dragged over ice. When I turned, there was a ring of lights hovering just above the far edge of the tree line, pulsing slowly. And in their center stood a figure tall, thin, the same blank oval where a face should be, catching the lights and throwing them back like a mirror. It lifted one hand, not in a wave, more like an invitation. The hum filled the air, and for the first time since the crash, I heard it say something clear in the shape of a syllable that did not belong to any human tongue. Whatever it meant, it was aimed at me. My bones remembered the weight of flying, of answering controls and failing. The air tasted like wire. I did the only human thing left to me. I took a step back. And now, when the wind is very still, I keep my keys in my fist and I sleep with the light on. Sometimes, in the dark between breaths, I swear I hear my own voice on the radio, not through static, but through a clean channel, saying something I don't remember speaking. The last fragment pulled from the recorder haunts me more than the crash report. A phrase warped into music that sounds like an address and a promise all at once. It repeats in my head until the hair on my arm stands. It ends with a sound that feels like the hinge of a door opening. I haven't flown since that night, and I don't know if I will again. Pilots are stubborn. We like to think we can chalk mysteries up to wind and wiring. But there are things that hide in the sky that aren't satisfied by technical answers. The real terror is quieter. That something saw me, learned my call sign, and kept it. That voice, whatever it was, knows my name now. And names are how doors get opened.